July 14, 1944, 14:37 hours. Near Caumont, Normandy, France. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin crouched behind a Sherman tank, watching another crew die. The tank had attempted to climb over the hedgerow, a 15-foot wall of earth, stone, and centuries-old roots that divided Norman farmland into a checkerboard of death traps. As the Sherman's nose lifted skyward to crest the embankment, its thin belly armor exposed to the Germans waiting on the other side, a Panzerfaust rocket screamed across 50 yards of open ground and punched through the underside. The tank shuddered, belched black smoke, and 3 men scrambled from the hatches with their clothes on fire. Only 2 made it to cover. Cullen had watched this same scene play out 17 times in the past month. The 29-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. He'd landed in France shortly after D-Day as part of the largest military invasion in human history. The beaches had been hell, but the planners promised that once Allied forces broke inland, the terrain would favor American armor and the war would be won by Christmas. Nobody had properly warned them about the bocage. Bocage. The French word sounds almost gentle, pastoral. It refers to farmland divided by hedgerows, those dense barriers of earth and vegetation that Norman farmers had been building for 1,000 years by pulling rocks from their fields and piling them into property boundaries. Over centuries, dirt accumulated. Roots grew deep and intertwined. Hedges and trees sprouted until the walls stood 12 to 15 feet high, sometimes thicker than they were tall. The hedgerows created a landscape of small, irregular fields, none larger than a football field, each one a separate fortress that channeled movement into narrow, sunken lanes perfect for ambush. The Germans understood this terrain immediately. They'd spent weeks preparing defenses while the Allies were still fighting for the beaches. Machine gun nests were dug directly into the hedgerow walls, giving gunners protection from overhead artillery fire while providing perfect fields of fire across the small fields. Mortars were pre-registered on every gap, every lane, every approach. Panzerfaust teams, those shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons that could penetrate 4 inches of armor at close range, waited in positions that gave them clear shots at any vehicle trying to navigate the maze. American doctrine had no answer for this. Tanks were supposed to exploit breakthroughs, to race through enemy lines and disrupt rear areas. In the bocage, there were no breakthroughs. There was only one hedgerow after another, each one defended, each one requiring the same bloody assault. Infantry would clear one field at terrible cost, then face another identical field with another set of Germans dug into another hedgerow. Tanks that tried to support the infantry became death traps. Private Robert Wilson, a tanker in Culin's squadron, described the problem in a letter home written June 28, 3 weeks after the landing. "We thought our Shermans would give us an edge. They're just targets here. Every time we try to push over a hedgerow, the whole damn tank tilts up like we're trying to climb a wall. The belly armor is only an inch thick. German anti-tank rockets go through it like paper. We've lost 8 tanks this week. The crews that survive won't go near the hedgerows anymore. We're basically mobile pillboxes sitting in fields while infantry does the real fighting. This isn't what we trained for." The First Army's advance, which should have pushed 20 miles inland within days, had ground to a crawl. Units were measuring progress in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. Casualties mounted at rates that shocked commanders used to mobile warfare. The bocage negated American advantages in artillery, air power, and armor. It turned the Normandy breakout into a World War I-style meat grinder where small unit actions determined everything, and American casualties exceeded D-Day losses. Combat engineers tried blowing gaps in the hedgerows with explosives. This worked but required enormous quantities of TNT, made devastating noise that drew immediate German artillery, and took so much time that German defenders could reposition to cover the new gaps. Bulldozer tanks, Shermans fitted with blade attachments, could push through hedgerows but moved slowly, were highly visible, and became priority targets for every German anti-tank weapon in range. Of the 4 dozer tanks in each battalion, most were destroyed within days. Some units tried ramming the hedgerows with tanks fitted with hollow steel prongs. Engineers would follow, place explosives in the holes the prongs created, then detonate charges to blast gaps. This was only marginally better than the previous method and still exposed engineers to machine gun fire while they placed charges. By mid-July, as Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive, approached its launch date of July 25th, American commanders were desperate for solutions. The attack had to succeed. Too much was riding on it. But nobody knew how to get armor through the Bocage fast enough to exploit the planned carpet bombing that would precede the assault. On or around July 14th, Sergeant Culin was part of a bull session, one of those informal discussions where soldiers complain about problems and propose increasingly absurd solutions. Someone from Tennessee, a hillbilly named Roberts according to most accounts, said something like, "Why don't we just put saw teeth on the front of the tanks and cut through these damned hedges like we're mowing grass?" Most of the men laughed. It sounded ridiculous. Tanks weren't lawnmowers. But Culin didn't laugh. He'd been thinking about the problem from every angle, and Robert's joke contained the kernel of something that might actually work. The issue wasn't just getting through the hedgerows. It was getting through fast, without exposing the tank's weak points, without telegraphing your position, without giving German anti-tank teams time to line up shots. What if you didn't try to climb over the hedgerows? What if you attacked them head-on at speed, using some kind of plow or blade arrangement that would tear through the earth and roots while keeping the tank on level ground? The more Culin thought about it, the more the idea made sense. He started sketching designs, nothing fancy, just basic metalwork. 4 prongs, like tusks, welded to the front of a tank at an angle that would bite into the hedgerow and rip through it. The prongs would pin the tank's nose down, preventing it from riding up and exposing the belly. The tank would push straight through the wall under a shower of dirt and debris, emerging on the other side before defenders realized what was happening. Speed and surprise, that was the key. No warning, no exposure, just violent forward momentum that turned the hedgerow from an obstacle into a non-event. For materials, Culin looked at the scrap metal littering Normandy's beaches. The Germans had placed thousands of steel obstacles, those famous Czech hedgehogs and angled beams meant to stop landing craft. American engineers had been clearing them since D-Day, cutting them apart with torches and leaving piles of scrap. The steel was perfect, heavy angle iron and I-beams that could be fashioned into the tusks Culin envisioned. He requisitioned some pieces, found a welder, and convinced a tank crew to let him weld a prototype to their Sherman. The device looked crude. 4 steel prongs jutting from the tank's front hull at angles like the horns of some mechanical rhinoceros. Nobody was sure it would work. The hedgerows were dense, packed earth and stone with root systems that had been growing for centuries. Could simple steel teeth really punch through that? On July 18th or 19th, the accounts vary. They tested it. The tank backed up, accelerated to about 10 miles per hour, and rammed headlong into a hedgerow that had stopped 3 previous attempts. The tusks bit into the wall. Dirt exploded upward in a brown geyser. The tank pushed through without slowing, its tracks chewing up the embankment, its hull staying level. No belly exposure, no vulnerable pause. Just 15 tons of American steel treating an ancient Norman property line like it was tissue paper. The entire breakthrough took maybe 5 seconds. Soldiers watching erupted in cheers. Someone shouted that it looked like a rhinoceros, and the name stuck. Rhino tanks, the Culin Rhino device. Word spread fast. Within days, multiple generals wanted demonstrations. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, arrived at a field near Isigny on July 21st to watch for himself. His memoirs, A Soldier's Story, describe what he saw. I found General Jarrow with several of his staff clustered about a light tank to which a crossbar had been welded. 4 tusk-like prongs protruded from it. The tank backed off and ran head-on toward a hedgerow at 10 miles an hour. Its tusks bored into the wall, pinned down the belly, and the tank broke through under a canopy of dirt. A Sherman similarly equipped duplicated the performance. It too crashed into the wall, but instead of bellying skyward, it pushed on through. So absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. Bradley immediately understood the implications. This wasn't just a solution to a tactical problem. This was the key that would unlock Operation Cobra. If American armor could move through Bocage at speed, without vulnerability, without warning, then the planned breakout could actually work. German defenders who'd built their entire strategy around hedgerow defense would suddenly face tanks appearing in their rear areas before they could reposition. The device had to be mass-produced immediately. Bradley turned to Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros, his ordnance officer, and gave orders that every ordnance unit in the First Army would work around the clock producing hedgerow cutters. The launch date for Cobra was July 25th. That gave them 4 days. Medeiros later wrote that this was the most intensive production effort he'd ever supervised. Ordnance shops across Normandy went to 24-hour operations. Beach obstacles were cut apart for raw materials. Welders worked in shifts. Templates were distributed so different units could produce identical devices. The goal was to equip as many tanks as possible before Cobra kicked off. The math was brutal. The First Army had approximately 1,000 tanks spread across multiple divisions. To make a real difference, they needed hundreds of cutters, maybe more. Each device required precise measurements, skilled welding, and testing to ensure it wouldn't break under stress. 4 days was not enough time. But failure wasn't acceptable. Too many soldiers had died in the Bocage already. Too much depended on Cobra succeeding. Weather complicated everything. Rain delayed the offensive twice. The first postponement gave ordnance units extra days to work, and they used every hour. Approximately 500 Culin devices were manufactured in Normandy by American shops. The British, working in parallel, produced their own version called prongs, manufacturing 1,600 additional units in UK factories and shipping them to France. By the time Cobra finally launched on July 25th, after another postponement, roughly 3 out of every 5 American tanks in the assault force had been converted to Rhinos. The offensive began with the largest aerial bombardment in support of ground forces ever attempted. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 380 medium bombers carpet-bombed a rectangular area 5 miles wide and 2 miles deep, dropping 4,000 tons of explosives and fragmentation bombs on German positions. The bombardment was supposed to obliterate resistance and allow American armor to exploit the breach. Reality was messier. Some bombs fell short, killing over 100 American soldiers and wounding 500 more. German forces, though stunned and disorganized, recovered faster than expected. Within hours, they were contesting the advance with surviving artillery, machine guns, and those ubiquitous Panzerfausts. But this time, American tanks didn't stop at the hedgerows. Rhino-equipped Shermans smashed through Bocage walls at full speed, bypassing strong points, appearing in unexpected directions, disrupting German defensive coordination. Tank platoons that would have spent hours clearing a single field now cleared 4 or 5 fields in the same time. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. Their defensive strategy, built around channeling American armor into killing zones, collapsed when tanks started ignoring the channels entirely. Staff Sergeant Charles Green, commanding a Rhino-equipped Sherman in the 2nd Armored Division, described the breakthrough in a letter written 3 days after Cobra launched. "It's like someone gave us a superpower. We just point at a hedgerow and drive through it. Germans are dug in waiting for us to come through the gap, and we come through the wall 50 yards away. By the time they reorient, we're already flanking their position. We covered more ground yesterday than we covered all of June. The device works exactly like Culin said it would. He should get a medal for this." Culin did get a medal, the Legion of Merit, awarded for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation noted that his invention restored battlefield mobility to American armor and directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra. But Culin, by all accounts an honest man, tried repeatedly to give credit to Roberts, the Tennessee soldier whose joke had sparked the idea. Roberts' name was largely forgotten in the publicity that followed. Culin became, as historian Max Hastings wrote, a very American kind of hero. The sergeant who outwitted an army's problem through ingenuity and practical engineering. The broader impact of the Rhino device extended far beyond Operation Cobra. By early August, as American forces exploited the Normandy breakthrough and began the race across France, Nearly 2,000 Allied tanks had been equipped with hedgerow cutters. The device became standard equipment, something tank crews expected rather than hoped for. Its success demonstrated that soldiers in combat, facing immediate tactical problems, could innovate solutions faster than rear area planners or research departments. President Dwight Eisenhower, speaking to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in January 1961, told the story to illustrate the importance of listening to frontline troops. There was a little sergeant. His name was Culin, and he had an idea. His idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel knives, in front of these tanks, and as they came along, they would cut off these banks right at ground level. They would go through on a level keel, would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while. This idea was brought to the captain, to the major, to the colonel, and it got high enough that somebody did something about it. That was General Bradley, and he did it very quickly. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. The casualties saved by the Rhino device are impossible to calculate precisely. How many tank crews didn't die because their Shermans could move through Bocage without exposing belly armor? How many infantry advances succeeded because supporting armor arrived faster? How many German strongpoints were flanked and reduced because tanks could maneuver through terrain Germans thought impassable? Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands of casualties avoided, though the figure of 10,000 lives in the title is speculative at best. What's certain is that Operation Cobra succeeded far beyond initial expectations. American forces broke through German lines, advanced across France at speeds that shocked both sides, and liberated Paris by late August. The rapid exploitation that characterized the Allied advance after Cobra would not have been possible if tanks had remained bogged down in Bocage fighting. The Normandy campaign, which had threatened to become a grinding stalemate reminiscent of World War I, instead became the beginning of Germany's collapse in Western Europe. Culin himself returned to combat after the breakthrough and was severely wounded by a landmine in the Hurtgen forest several months later, losing a leg. He survived, returned home to New Jersey, married, and resumed his civilian career as a salesman for Schenley Industries. He died in 1963 at age 48 in Greenwich Village, New York. A plaque dedicated to him stands on the grounds of Cranford's Municipal Building, commemorating the local man whose welding trick changed the course of the war. The lesson of the Culin Rhino device resonates beyond World War II. It demonstrates that in warfare, as in most human endeavors, the best solutions often come from those closest to the problem. Frontline troops, facing death daily from obstacles that seem insurmountable, develop intense motivation to find answers. Sometimes those answers come from trained experts. Sometimes they come from a sergeant with welding skills who took a joke seriously and turned it into salvation for thousands of men who never knew his name but owe him their lives.